Good afternoon. Is that working? I'm Brian Katulis. Welcome to the Center for American Progress for our session on pathways to de-escalating Middle East tensions. Thanks for showing up, and for those of you who are online. We have high ambitions for this session this afternoon, and we're lucky to have actually such a very distinguished audience here, and thanks folks for coming. Two main sort of high ambitions. One is to do something different here in Washington, which is try to generate new ideas and actually concrete ideas and new thinking, which is, I think, quite ambitious. What we're not likely to do, I should highlight, and much to maybe the disappointment of some of my colleagues, including Peter's, we're not going to have our hot takes on the Conan, the special operations dog that was part of the raid against al-Baghdadi. What we're trying to do is take a bigger picture look at practical steps on diplomacy. The second thing we want to do is to take an overview of the whole region, which is actually quite ambitious, but I'm confident with the panel that we have up here and the people we have in the audience and the conversation I think we're likely to have is to take a snapshot of the Middle East as a whole, which is not easy to do. Quite often you'll go to a think tank session and it's fixated on Iran or the nuclear deal. We want to try to tackle all of it while also having some sort of coherence to it. And in today's Middle East, you have active wars in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya. You have popular uprisings that are producing some limited violence, and then perhaps, as we see today in Lebanon, political change. But you have uprisings in Iraq, Algeria, Sudan, even Egypt in recent weeks has seen sort of some elements of protest. So you have that sort of across the region, deep conflicts and then also unrest. But the two overarching, I think, things we'll try to focus on here this afternoon are the tensions with Iran, because as we know in the last few months, there have been incidents and flashpoints that could have easily led to a regional war, and that's a dominant focus of the work that we're trying to do here at the center, and we've done a number of discussions on that topic. And then the second sort of conflict, which is often not discussed, but is certainly in our politics here, and I think still remains certainly important, is the Arab-Israeli conflict, which remains unresolved. So we have a very distinguished panel of experts. We're going to, sort of our game plan here is to have a conversation between us in the next 45 minutes to an hour to hear their views and exchange the views. And then we'll open it up to people in the audience. We have people from different embassies, and thank you to the Omani ambassador for being here and our friends from around the region. I think that's what makes it a very rich discussion that we're about to have. So let me introduce the panel from your left towards me. First, we have Yasmine Farouk, from a visiting scholar at the Carnegie, and she focuses on the Gulf and the broader Arab world and Middle East. My friend Nimrod Goren from Israel, with Mitvim, a founder and president of a very important, I think, think tank in Israel. And then Ariana Tabatabai. She told me I was going to mess it up because everybody would do it. With RAND, and if you've not seen her work this year on Iran, it's tremendous. So we're going to start with the person, for no other rhyme or reason, who came the furthest, which is Nimrod, who's based in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and teaches out there, to hear his views. And his institute, I think, cuts against the grain of what I think is the dominant Israeli narrative right now, which is a little bit more center-right. You're a progressive institution, and you've been an analyst and an advocate for a progressive Israeli foreign policy, which I think we want to hear all about. But we want to hear sort of how you see Israel looking at this regional landscape, the current leadership, and then we'll get into sort of your ideas and recommendations about how to de-escalate some of the tensions. So, Nimrod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you all for coming. I'm here in town for the JCIT conference, just concluded yesterday, and both are very strong messages supporting peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and it was very important for me as an Israeli to hear the discourse here in Washington. I will try in the brief moment that we have to speak a bit about the current policies of the outgoing government of Israel on issues relating to the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and the change of nature in Israeli-Arab relations, and also suggest some ideas that we're trying to promote within our political system on how to improve Israel's foreign policy. Israel is in a transition phase. We do not have a functioning government at the moment. We have a prime minister that is gradually, what it seems, on his way out of our political system, and we're trying to shape the agenda for a next government, which we don't really know what it will look like. It's a time to assess how our foreign policy went over the last few years, and while you saw much activism by our Prime Minister Netanyahu on the international agenda, you saw significant opportunities being missed out on. We saw the last few years not advancing Israeli-Palestinian peace, not taking the potential of Israel-Arab relations to its fulfillment, Israel distancing itself in a way from its traditional alliance in the liberal democratic camp and coming closer to other countries which are not necessarily the ones that we would like us to see as their allies. There was also a deliberate weakening of the diplomatic service in Israel, of the foreign ministry, and this is something that is making an impact on our foreign policy in general. Specifically on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, what has been happening over the last few years is a backtracking for the commitment on the two-state solution. If Netanyahu was speaking in 2009, 2010 about his support in principle, which you can debate, on the two-state solution, recently the steps that he's been taking are exactly the opposite, in a way openly working to prevent a situation that could lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state, whether by maintaining the split between the West Bank and Gaza, whether by trying to make the Israeli-Palestinian issue less of a relevant topic for debate, both within the Israeli public discourse and the international agenda, and doing that, by the way, quite successfully. In the lead-up to our elections, the two elections that we had this year, the Israeli-Palestinian issue was not very high on the debate. And you don't see much public activism about that. Israel and the Palestinian Authority still have a strong security coordination. They still cooperate on economic issues, but this is done in parallel to a delegitimization by Israel of the Palestinian leadership, which is committed to nonviolence and to the two-state solution. What is happening in parallel are changes in Israel-Arab relations. And during the last 5 years, you saw the relationship between Israel and key Arab states changing. They've been changing due to several reasons. Some are regional dynamics, some are security concerns, some are domestic changes in some of the Arab states, some relate to the different image through which Israelis view Arab countries in the years after the Arab Spring. And there's a debate as how much this is linked to the Palestinian issue or not. Since the last 5 years, Netanyahu is making the case that you can flip the sequence of the Arab Peace Initiative. The historic offer and the positive offer by the Arab League in 2002 to have normal relations with Israel, collective position by the Arab world in return to peace treaties between Israel and its neighbors. The argument we've been hearing by our leadership is that you can change the sequence, first have a breakthrough with the Arab countries, only then move ahead with the Palestinian issue. And despite the positive developments in bilateral levels that we've been seeing in recent years, I don't think this is the case. So it is a very clear glass ceiling to what can happen between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Some of it we're seeing with some of your countries that you're coming from. You see higher visibility of the relationship between Israel and some Arab neighbors. You see positive messaging and statements coming from officials all through media interviews. You see more public engagement, all kind of delegations, not official ones, participation of Israeli officials in multinational settings and environments and meetings in Gulf states, tourism with some of the countries, sporting events. So there are indicators of the change that could happen, but that change is very limited and is not fulfilled because of the stagnation on the Israeli-Palestinian track. Part of these regional issues come to play in Syria and vis-a-vis Iran, and what we saw in the last few weeks happening in Syria, while not being a direct security threat to Israel, did change the Israeli discourse regarding the American position in the region. Israel has an interest of the U.S. playing a role in the Middle East. Traditionally, whatever the president was, it was the U.S. that was taking care of Israel's interest in the Middle East. And having Russia as a more significant actor on the expense of the Americans is something that there is quite a consensus in Israel from left to right that is not a good development. But until now, there were not many critical voices on Trump's policies in the Middle East in Israel. Even on the Israeli left, people who promote and want to advance peace with the Palestinians, when they see the steps that Trump took vis-a-vis the Palestinian leadership, which were not constructive to advance peace, they didn't speak up. because it's an American president, and in Israel you want to have good relations with the American administration. What happened in Syria led to a change or to cracks in this debate, and now you have criticism of how Trump deals with its allies and how Trump shapes the American involvement in the Middle East, and that discussion could lead to other cracks on other issues as well. And the Iranian issue, while Israel is focusing a lot on trying to limit Iran's involvement in Syria, a key foreign policy, national security priority for Israel, there is also an exaggeration, overplaying of the Iranian issue in our political system. So if you have to make a prioritization or hierarchy of security issues, my sense is that the Palestinian issue has much more influence on Israel's regional standing and security than the Iranian issue, despite it's an issue we have to deal with. What we're trying to do at our institute at this time of political change is to try to advance a different approach to Israel's foreign policy, one that prioritizes progress towards the peace with the Palestinians, that looks at a multi-regional setting, so it identifies Israel in a place which has different regions around it. It's not only about the Middle East, it's about the Mediterranean, in which new regional forums are being set up with Egypt, with Jordan, with other countries, but also with Europe, and this interlinkage between issues in foreign policy, while also empowering the diplomatic apparatus and bringing Israel back into the kind of the democratic club of nations. I think this is the type of thing that we want to see in order to have Israel fulfill its potential in the region and in the international community.
Thank you, Nimrod. That's a great way to kick it off. And the central point that you make, that your alternative vision, if you look at on your website of an alternative vision, it would put the Arab-Israeli conflict higher priority than it is compared to the Iran threat perceptions. Just yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about the threat of missiles in Yemen, potentially threatening Israel. And again, this is whatever the reality of that is something, to your point, that dominates the political conversation in many ways. And what's dominated the political conversation, at least until the recent Syria decision here in the United States, has been this effort by President Trump of what they label maximum pressure. And I think the simple sort of analysis is that maximum pressure has produced maximum resistance from Iran. So we'll turn to Ariane to give her sort of analysis on where Iran is in the region and how it views the region.
Thank you, and to the Center for having me. I think it's safe to say that it's not just maximum pressure producing maximum resistance. It's at this point, it's actually maximum pressure producing maximum pressure on the Iranian side. And I'm going to break that down a little bit to the regional prism. It's not a secret that Iran has long seen the rest of the region, specifically the Gulf Arabs, as sort of outsourcing their security to the United States and seeing their own regional standing as a function of U.S. policy in the region. I think that has been exacerbated by the events of the past couple of years, since 2018 specifically, when in May, President Trump withdrew the United States from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And so initially, Iran started this policy that they dubbed strategic patience, which entailed essentially not doing anything to rock the boat too much. They sat on their hands as the U.S. started to impose maximum pressure, a campaign that is centered largely around sanctions as the only tool to change Iran's behavior. The way the Iranians perceived the response to the maximum pressure campaign was that the United States was the active perpetrator. The regional states were either passive supporters or passive observers of the maximum pressure campaign. And so the events of the past 8 or 9 months since May 2019, I think, can be best described as Iran trying to bring these countries, the Europeans, regional states, into the fold and to try to make them into stakeholders. The idea being that until May 2019, Iran was the only country that was paying a price for the U.S. policy. And it was the only recipient of the maximum pressure campaign. It was the only one that was suffering the consequences of the Trump administration's policies. And that by taking action on the nuclear front, sort of raising the stakes for the Europeans and taking action in the Persian Gulf and then via proxies, it was actually it was able to bring the GCC and other regional states into the fold as well. So I think recent Iranian actions have had both negative and positive consequences for Iran. I think they have overplayed their hand on some level where they've changed sort of the conversation around Iran internationally, whereas during the period of strategic patience, Iran was seen as sort of being the recipient of, being on the other end of the U.S. incoherent strategy of the U.S. being an unreliable, incoherent partner in the JCPOA. Today, Iran is also seen as part of the blame. But I think regionally there has been some positive outcomes for Iran for its decision to shift the situation a little bit. And that's the fact that today we're seeing more effort by the Gulf countries to reopen channels of communication. So in some way, I think that if you're sitting in Tehran and you're looking at the events of the past few months, you're thinking, okay, well, we have probably paid a cost in terms of losing some EU support, but today you have the Emiratis and the Saudis trying to reopen channels of communication, which, again, from the Iranian perspective, had not been the case in a while. And then this year at UNGA, as Iran typically does, it came up with this initiative that is grand and no one really knows what it means, but it's called HOPE. It's the acronym, and it's an initiative that is sort of designed as a kind of an offer to the GCC, I think specifically, to try to talk about maritime security, although it is ironic since Iran is really the main country at fault there for rocking the boat in the Gulf and in the Strait of Hormuz. But nonetheless, they're seeing that as an effort to sort of reach out to the GCC and say, hey, we can have a regional dialogue about this without the United States, because ultimately, and I think these are precisely Rouhani's words at UNGA, saying that, look, the U.S. is going to go at some point. The U.S. is not your neighbor, but we, Iran, are your neighbor and will be your neighbor long after the U.S. is gone. So they're also playing on, again, this perception that the U.S. policy is incoherent, that the U.S. is unreliable, and they're trying to kind of to change the conversation in the region around Iranian responsibility for recent actions. So going forward, I think there are two buckets of issues that we'll have to deal with. One is the bucket that is mostly affecting the United States, that are core U.S. objectives and interests, and I'm putting mostly the nuclear issue there. Any nuclear negotiations in the future, whether it's in the context of the JCPOA, whether it's an entirely different beast, will have to have the U.S. and Iran at its center. I don't think that is the case for regional conflicts. Of course, we have an interest in the region, we have an interest in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere, and the U.S. should be a part of those conversations. But in my view, it would be a mistake to have that be centered around the U.S. and Iran. It should really be a regional conversation in order for it to, A, be attainable and be sustainable in the long run. In both of those contexts, though, and we have a recent report on this, where we try to identify where there may be zones of possible agreements, both between the U.S. and Iran, but also in the region more generally. I think it's important to pay attention to some of the domestic dialogue taking place around national security in Iran. And, you know, there's, of course, speech is limited in Iran, we all know that, but there is quite a vigorous debate around national security within the elites. And so there are red lines that emerge from areas of consensus where there's clarity within the elites that certain things are not going to be bargaining chips. Think of the enrichment program, for example, generally speaking, or Iran's missile program. The fact that no Iranian, I think, would come to the table and say, we will just give up all missile activities for the foreseeable future. But there are also areas where there are disagreements within the system about what sort of capabilities Iran needs. And those are the places where we can actually have zones of possible agreement. I'm thinking, for example, of the range of Iranian missiles, right? It's clear that everyone wants a missile program, but it's not clear how far these missiles should be able to go. the Supreme Leader has said 2,000 kilometers, others have said 5,000, and others have said less than 2,000. So those are the areas where we are able to actually come up with solutions to some of the biggest concerns that both the United States and also its partners have in the region. And I think that those are the kind of, if you're thinking about sort of, moving forward, how can we come up with sort of novel ideas? Those are places to look and to think about, we can't ask Iran to give up all missile activity for the future, but we can look for ways to kind of curtail some of the more problematic elements of it. And I think that's something that we need to think about both in the context of U.S.-Iran relations and potential dialogue, but also in the sort of regional context as well.
Great. Thanks very much. And last but not least, Yasmine, you're going to talk about the Gulf Arab states and primarily Saudi Arabia, which these days is a heavily sort of emotional and politicized topic in this town. And what I admire about your work is that it's clinical and it's balanced and it looks at sort of the good and the bad and it stakes out sort of a view. And I know you're going to focus a bit more on Saudi Arabia, but we all know that there's a diversity of views throughout the Arab world about the complicated mix. So how do you see these states looking at this new landscape, particularly over the last few months after these tensions with Iran flaring up?
Thank you very much for the invitation, Brian, and for the kind words. It's really not easy to talk about Iran or to talk about Gulf countries or Saudi Arabia right now in DC. But what I really like about this panel is that you try to move beyond analysis and to try to finding what now, what to do. And this is something that lacks in, but that has started, some articles have started to appear on this, but I am really glad that this is your approach to what we're going to talk about. I will focus on my presentation, mainly my focal point in studying the region is Saudi Arabia, because it's, when you're talking about Gulf countries, this is 3/4 of the Arabian Peninsula, and it is it's a regional power. It's a regional power, and as you know, the State Minister of Foreign Affairs of Saudi Arabia called it a developing country with really global outreach. So we're talking about a country that has, a very special status. I am going to try to zoom out a bit from what Ariane and Nimrod has said, and to enlarge a little bit the time frame, to look at the regional landscape actually in a post-Arab Spring, from a post-Arab Spring perspective, because I see that a lot of the reactions of whether Saudi Arabia or other Gulf countries or other Arab countries in general to what's happening in the region is really against this background, against the background of what happened in 2011. And to me, the general framework of this is really motivated by a never again approach. And never again, not only in what happened during the Arab Spring, but also in controlling the international consequences to what happened and how it was dealt with by major international powers, including the US. And in this never again approach, I will try to situate, the things that we're talking about today. So the Saudi regional policy after 2011, as I see it, and it had some continuity with the new leadership when it came into power in 2015. First of all, was, had a strategy of more interventionist and upfront and even sometimes de facto go-it-alone policy, which we were not used to in the case of Saudi Arabia, that was more of a low-profile lead from behind power. It had started shifting this low profile, after 2006, mainly in the region, after the invasion of Iraq, the mounting power of Iran, and after the Hezbollah-Israel war, when it saw that it needed to stand up to the Iranian expansion. So this de facto go-it-alone policy and interventionist policy to support ally, but also to confront foes, explained Saudi actions, in Egypt after 2013, but also in Bahrain, of course in Yemen. We have seen it in Syria at the beginning of the conflict. We're seeing it in Libya. We're seeing it in Sudan. We're even seeing it in the Horn of Africa and around the Red Sea. So this has become, a new strategy in the Saudi regional policy in the region. The second component of the regional strategy, as I see it, is diversifying the sources of regional and international support, not to Saudi Arabia as a country only, but to the Saudi regime, to the current Saudi leadership. It's, before the Arab Spring, in the literature about Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, you would always read about the 1979 moment or shock in those countries when they saw the American reaction to the revolution against the Shah of Iran. In 2011, there was the Mubarak moment of, letting Mubarak go, in Egypt. So you've seen Saudi Arabia and other countries diversifying the interests in the Saudi regime itself. So you've seen them reaching out to authoritarian solidarity with Russia and China. And of course, whatever I am saying has its limit and has its challenges. So I'm just, giving headlines and would love to discuss further in the Q&A. So part of this diversification was reaching out for this authoritarian solidarity from international powers that can provide international cover to the regime, but also contribute to defense and contribute to more strategic defense of the regime itself. And second of all, sources of, that provide the human element of this defense and of solidarity with the regime. Traditionally, that was Egypt, but Egypt has been very conservative when it comes to the use and the intervention of its army outside of its borders, but this is also what you see with Pakistan, what you see with Sudan, what you see with Chad. The third component of the Saudi strategy is actually as a reaction to the American position from the Arab Spring, was the thinking of how to tie the US down to the region. So you had at the same time the thinking of diversifying the sources of support, but not to replace the US. It's just to have a safety network, but then a thinking of how to keep the US linked to the region, or how to keep it present in the region. And I think this is something that brings Israel in, because this is a common interest for the two countries, and there is a thinking in the region, not only in Saudi Arabia but elsewhere, that the closer you get to Israel, the closer you get to the United States. Now the fact is today in Washington DC that if you're thinking about Saudi Arabia and Israel today, they both have problems in this town. But the thinking for so long has been that, Israel gets you closer to the White House, and especially to this White House and to this Trump administration. So we've seen changing positions from Saudi Arabia on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on relations with Israel, and integrating Israel really into the conception of regional security in projects like the Middle East Strategic Alliance, for example. You can easily fit Israel in that. In the maritime security in the Gulf, Israel has declared that they are ready to do that. In the new security entity in the Red Sea that Saudi Arabia was trying to mount, for those who are following it, the initial conception did not include the world of Arab and African countries bordering the Red Sea. It was generic, but again, part of the challenges that I would love to discuss in the Q&A is that some of the countries still resist this new Saudi conception. So, as you said, you mentioned Netanyahu's, yesterday's statement on Yemen, saying, actually stating publicly that they have a stake in what's going on in Yemen. Now you're saying we don't know about the reality of how the Houthis and Iran can reach, or whether they can reach Israel from Yemen. But I thought about it the other way around. What if Israel is present next to Yemen? So it's not necessarily reaching Israel where it is. It's actually reaching Israel in a closer nearby. So to me, that is, the third component of it that integrates Israel in the region. It's tying down the US to the region, doing it through Israel, through new security architecture. And even if you look in the Saudi case to the domestic developments, something like the Vision 2030, which is, so motivating the Saudi economy, it has a heavy regional component in it that perfectly relies, 3 of the 4 giga projects in the Saudi Vision 2030 are on the Red Sea. All of them directly touch on Israel's strategic interests. And so there is really this is where I do situate, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israel in the escalation and the dynamics currently in the Gulf. And then the fourth component of the Saudi strategy after 2011 that fits this escalation and fits all this file is, of course, Iran. There needs to understand that just like the 3 elements that I mentioned, Iran is looked at from a national security perspective. It is not only a question of regional influence. It's a question of domestic stability. It's a question of regime survival for a country like Saudi Arabia and for other countries in the Gulf. So when we talk about Yemen, we're not just talking about the competition over regional influence. When Saudi Arabia talks about the role of Iran in Yemen, it's talking really about domestic politics. Yemen is considered to be, kind of domestic domestic politics to Saudi Arabia. It's not distant, it's not completely perceived as another country. And so the competition and the Saudi strategy vis-a-vis Iran, be it, of course, primarily in Yemen, but elsewhere in the Arab world, in Syria, most recently in Iraq, in Lebanon, or even if you go all the way to Nigeria, is something that Saudi Arabia links directly to its national security and not just to regional competition. Now, the problem is that, to me, as I look at this Saudi strategy, is that this never again approach of never again of the Arab Spring, but also never again of being let down by the United States is not really working, because it has a lot of challenges, and because a major component of it is relying on the United States. So actually, whereas you don't want to see the same reaction from the United States, Saudi Arabia and other countries are trying to change the behavior of Washington instead of trying to find, another solution from Washington and, securing a strong safety network away from Washington. Another challenge that I see is that core of the competition, the core of Saudi Arabia's global reach that I talked about, and really the core of its influence, whether in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or vis-a-vis Iran or elsewhere, is really its Islamic outreach, right? And with what's going on right now inside Saudi Arabia in terms of religious reforms, and also its war in Yemen and the pressure that was put on Saudi Arabia in the war against terrorism, is actually reducing this kind of influence and putting a lot of challenge on it. The second component in the Saudi global influence and also a heavy component of its role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or in trying to form a regional influence against Iran, for example, is its financial tools, right? Today, Saudi Arabia also is facing, challenges, serious challenges, domestic challenges to this financial tool that I would love to discuss, in the Q&A.
Thanks very much. I want to organize the conversation around two big topics, and the first being the main focus, and I think the most urgent, but maybe not as important, which is Iran. More important maybe being Arab-Israeli, which would be second. On Iran, and you talked about perhaps some wiggle room within the Iranian position on missiles and the range of missiles, and there's dissension within the system. And then more recently, Yasmine, and maybe start with you two and then follow up with Nimrod, there have been talks of the Emiratis going to Iran and trying to have a channel there. There's always talks of Saudis and others, and Oman also is one that tries to talk to everyone to reduce tensions. What are some additional steps beyond, or areas beyond the missile system in Iran? Is there lower hanging fruit in particular regional theaters, whether it's Yemen or Iraq or Syria, as dynamic as it is, where a conversation primarily through the region and with diplomacy can try to de-escalate tensions? Is there more to this HOPE initiative that maybe you were only outlining in thumbnail sketch there? Is there real discussions? So start with you two, and then Nimrod, maybe not with the current Israeli government. It's hard to conceive, and let me stipulate that even a lot of what we're talking about here in Washington with a President Trump probably seems a little academic, because it implies a strong emphasis on diplomacy as opposed to Twitter or military action. But I think it's important to explore for the purposes of that. So where do you two see, and then in Israel, in a new Israel, maybe with a different leadership, that wanted to turn down temperature as opposed to increase pressure on Iran, what would be some practical steps?
So actually, Yasmine's point about Yemen, I think, lends itself beautifully to this, to answering your question, which is that I think what is interesting about Yemen is that it is a national security issue, not just an influence issue for Saudi Arabia. It is exactly the opposite for Iran. And in that sense, it stands in contrast with some of the other theaters, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, if we want to go further east, Afghanistan even, where Iran does see actual national security reasons for being there. Differently, right? Afghanistan and Iraq share borders, populations with Iran. Lebanon, it's because of Hezbollah being sort of the core of its national security approach with non-state actors, and Syria, of course, with having one of its only, if not only, state ally in jeopardy for a few years. So there is a big distinction there, and I think that that's why Yemen would actually lend itself to a good start to any kind of negotiation between the two sides. For Iran, it's just been a really low-cost way of poking the Saudis in the eye. There is no national security justification, and I think the Iranians recognize it, right, that they don't really have national security concerns in Yemen. There's no shared territory. There's no shared population. And it's exactly the opposite of that for Saudi Arabia. So I think that Iran would be willing, especially now that I think the conflict has been going on for 4 years, right? Iran has gotten what it wants from the conflict, which is a decrease in Saudi prestige, sunk resources, divisions within the GCC, divisions between the GCC, Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the one hand, and the US on the other. So you have all of these things that Iran, I think, in its wildest dreams couldn't have fathomed 4 years ago, but that it's managed to get by largely sitting out and supporting the Houthis without a huge cost to its own in terms of resources, in terms of lives, etc. So I think that Yemen still is the best bet in terms of getting the conversation started. But I don't know if you think that that's also the case still from the Saudi perspective.
Well, there is some kind of, emerging consensus that you hear a lot about Yemen being, the first starting point to build confidence between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that that was actually part of the, the French-led European initiative, that this is what Saudi Arabia gets. So, that would be the file where Iran would prove that it's worthy of the trust, that it will live up to all the good intentions that President Rouhani stated at UNGA and that Zarif is stating, that it will prove that it's worth of the Saudi trust and could hence be the opening or the start to some kind of Saudi-Iranian dialogue. And it would also, save President Trump's face saying that, Iran has given something so we can talk, which is, these are not my ideas, really. They are discussed all over town, and this was the core of the French-led initiative. And so I think that sadly enough for Saudi Arabia, whether it wants it or not at this point, it may really end up accepting that Yemen becomes the starting point of de-escalation in the Gulf. But initially, I really don't think that this is what Saudi Arabia wanted, because, it is one thing of stating for years that Iran is backing the Houthis, and this is why the Houthis are threatening Saudi Arabia, and this is why Saudi Arabia is intervening in Yemen. And it is another thing of accepting that the Iranians, solve the problem in Yemen, because this really basically means that you're accepting a role for Iran in Saudi Arabia's own national security. So it's not easy, but because of the current situation, because of the war that has been going on, because of the inability of Saudi Arabia to have a military victory, it may end up having to accept this fact, because other parties such as the United States, the Europeans, the Iranians, and other regional parties all kind of agree that Yemen can be the starting point. It's the most feasible, it's the most realistic. And I haven't seen a Saudi, staunch public objection, for example, to the French initiative. They did not come out in support of it, but it was until like 2 days ago in an interview with Adel Al-Jubair in a French newspaper, when he was asked directly about the French initiative, he said, we think that the only way to deal with Tehran is maximum pressure. So it's not that it was, they did not reject it. And I think there are talks, we read in the news about mediated talks about Yemen, but Yemen, this situation is really the paradox of the Saudi policy. It's, you spend years saying we are fighting the war in Yemen because of the Iranians, and now everybody's telling you, okay, the Iranians want to solve the problems, but if you accept the Iranians around the table, means you accept that they have a role in your own personal national security. But this is where I see it start, because there is kind of an international consensus. Now, does Saudi Arabia need this? I still believe that Saudi Arabia can solve its problem in Yemen without Iran. Saudi Arabia presence and influence and role in Yemen goes back for decades. They have direct contacts with the Houthis, they have direct contacts with other factions inside Yemen, and it is not the first time that they are in this situation.
Before we go to Nimrod, can you say a little bit about how other Gulf states, whether it's the UAE, Oman, or Bahrain, have positioned themselves on Yemen? And do you see a repositioning there vis-a-vis especially Iran?
There is definitely a repositioning. I mean, you don't see, you know, in 2015 when the coalition started, first of all, not all countries that were included in the Saudi coalition actually actively participated in the war, right? And you had some countries like Oman, for example, that were never really part of this coalition. Today, de facto, on the ground, you have the Saudis, the Emiratis are repositioning themselves, and they were the first to come out and call for a dialogue with Iran and actually implement this dialogue. Other Gulf countries and other Arab countries who have presence are really reluctant, especially those of them who have, you know, direct relations with the U.S. are reluctant today to say that, yeah, we are present in Yemen and we're still supporting the war. So in general, aside from, you know, a country, for example, like Bahrain that supports Saudi Arabia all the way, other Gulf countries also are part of this consensus on wanting to end the war in Yemen. If you think about Oman, if you think about Kuwait, if you think about Qatar for its own reasons that don't necessarily have to do with the interests of the Yemeni people, and if you think about the Emirates that changed its policy, today even inside the Gulf inside the Gulf Cooperation Council, there is this tacit agreement that Yemen should end for so many reasons, and each has his own interest in it.
So, and then Nimrod, my hypothetical that both Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump bump their heads in the morning and forget about maximum pressure on Iran and want to de-escalate. What would an Israeli sort of try to do? Obviously, sort of the theater in Syria and Lebanon is the most immediate, given the recent missile strikes or the military strikes that Israel's conducted, not only in Syria, but also apparently in Iraq. What would be an active gesture, do you think, it would be possible for a future Israeli government to try to de-escalate with Iran?
When we speak about a different Israeli government, we need to remember that it will not be an ideological shift. It's not as if we're moving from a right-wing government to a left-wing government. We're definitely moving more to a centralized one, but one that has a strong military component within its leadership. The Blue-White Party of Gantz has two other chief of staff, former chief of staff in its leadership, and the mindset is still a security-oriented one. I think that will shape how Israel will continue to relate to Iran on Lebanon and Syria. Where it may change is on the Iran nuclear deal, because the Iran nuclear deal, the discourse within Israel, within the security establishment, within the diplomatic establishment, was from the onset a different discourse than that of Netanyahu and the government. Some of it went public. You would hear Israeli generals going on record talking about opportunities and benefits for Israel from the Iran deal. So it's not as if when you flip from Netanyahu's policies on the deal, you flip away from the security establishment. It's even you tap into it. So that's why I think there will be a possibility for a different approach there, partly also because one of the fixes in Israeli foreign policy that you can expect from such a government is to once again prioritize international engagement and working with partners in Europe, with the countries in Europe who are signatories of the deal, and in being open to a different type of debate on different type of issues. I think, though, the process that you mentioned, Yasmine, about countries in the Gulf opening up all kind of channels or reevaluating policies towards Iran may lead the people in the next Israeli government to reevaluate whether it was wise to frame the entire progress in Israel-Arab relations on the Iran security issues. So when relations with Saudi Arabia are prioritized within the Israeli debate over relation with Jordan, I think that should be reversed. And the countries with which Israel has peace agreement with, countries which are immediate neighbors, these are the countries with which the priorities on relationships should be put on and go beyond the security. So it's a different type of discourse. Yes, look for the joint concern on security issues, but understand that you also need to explore economic, political, civilian relations, and those in turn will not only help to promote peace, but also help Israel in the field of security.
That's interesting, because what you're suggesting is there'll still be a very assertive posture on the regional security issues for Israel because of what they see in their threat perceptions, but perhaps there's an opening on a return to the JCPOA or a talk of a new Iran nuclear deal. That's what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and it depends on what the international community will do, because Israel will not be the leading actor in that. Yeah. But if there is movement within the international community towards such a place, then there will be an openness for a different type of Israeli debate on that. At the time, Netanyahu rejected the option of even being indirectly involved in the negotiations. Right. There were reports about Angela Merkel offering Israel to indirectly influence the negotiations, which he rejected from the onset. So Israel, not only that, it was very close to different international initiatives, from incentive for peace to Iran negotiations. And that may change. So those channels of Israeli impact, Israeli influence on international diplomacy, I think will be on the rise.
I just would like to add a point to what he said, that it is indeed, it was the U.S. and, clearly Saudi will to, replace Jordan or Egypt in terms of priority with, in terms of priority in Arab-Israeli relations. And I think because there is not a consensus on that, and because it poses a competition, it poses a problem for both Jordan and Egypt, that it's not easily something that they can fulfill. Saudi Arabia hasn't been able, despite the support from the Trump administration, to replace Jordan or Egypt, both of them, their importance in the national security of Israel, or in terms of influencing the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian peace process.
And you see a difference between how Israelis relate to Egypt and Jordan, because Egypt is perceived as a very important country, the relationships are on the rise, security coordination, natural gas cooperation. But with Jordan, we just marked 25 years of peace, and it went almost unnoticed. We sent a group from our institute to Amman to have a policy dialogue, because so little people now value the importance of Jordan, and maybe that is the most important relationship that we have in the region.
It coincides also with the tension between, you have this, so the Jordanian-Israeli relations are in a very bad place right now. It coincides also with Jordanian-Saudi relations being in a very bad place right now.
This is a perfect segue to the second topic, and then we'll open it up to your questions or comments. I think on Iran, we could talk much further, and I want to recognize you had a piece a couple of months ago about how maybe a return to the JCPOA won't even be practical. So maybe before we go to Arab-Israel, what's interesting is try to square sort of your thought, which I think is interesting, and I think a lot of people on our side, which supported the Iran nuclear deal, myself included, see the return to such a deal as an important objective, and I agree with that. But I wanted to maybe give you a chance to say what you had argued in that piece, just to introduce a little bit more nuance in terms of what is the actual next practical step to de-escalate tensions.
So my co-author actually, I think, is right there, Lisa. I think I saw you somewhere. So the idea being that, as much as I think many of us would like to return to the JCPOA and forget that the past few years have happened, that may not be feasible, right? 2021, January 2021 is not going to be November 2016, and things may just get more complicated in about a week when Iran is scheduled to announce the fourth step that it's going to take on the nuclear front, dialing down its compliance even more with the JCPOA. So I don't know how many steps there are supposed to be, and if one of them may be to withdraw entirely from the JCPOA, but we have to start thinking about what happens next if there is no JCPOA to build upon. And I think part of the challenge that we're seeing in our conversations in Washington certainly is that we are taking for granted that there will be a JCPOA to build on come January 2021, and that may not be the case. So I don't have the perfect solution here in terms of what what we can do to address that. And I think that things are so fluid currently that it is hard to plan on some level for January 2021. Should there be a different administration, we should also add that. But it is important to start thinking about all the options that are available to us, and that we may very well be going back to a pre-JCPOA sort of situation, a 2012, even pre-Oman channel sort of situation, and start from scratch. Yeah,
and that's a dangerous scenario, and I would say, again, why I think that's very urgent and dynamic in the next few months. It could lead to all sorts of uncertainties and hopefully not, but maybe more conflict. On the Arab-Israeli front, we're just a few months from when Bahrain hosted a conference that brought all of the region together, and there was sort of the reveal of an economic plan. I'd like to ask all of you, including maybe start with Yasmine, with the Arab world reaction, but then Nimrod, how you see sort of Israel positioned in all of this. Jared Kushner's still there, but Jason Greenblatt, his deputy, is now resigned and moved on back to the private sector. Where's this all going? How has the region reacted first to this? And they showed up in Bahrain, but then what do you anticipate next? What's likely to happen? Nimrod, inside of Israel, what do you see next, given this dynamic situation politically inside of Israel? And then lastly, how does Iran and its leadership talk about and instrumentalize this issue and the approach of the United States?
So there are some words that I hear here in DC about the Arab-Israeli conflict, and then some arguments that I would like to, use this opportunity to respond to. First of all, when you hear that, this growing intensity in Israeli-Arab relations, you hear immediately sometimes the word of normalization. Israel has been having peace with Egypt and Jordan. I don't know if Israelis think that these are the kind of normal relations that they want to have with the rest of the Arab world. And I think these two cases of Egypt and Jordan should be used as an example. It's very hard for me to see normal relations between Israel or, for example, Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region without, solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But does this mean that this security coordination, that Israel's implication in new security arrangements, especially if the escalation with Iran continues, will stop? I don't think it will stop. And I think that, for example, if you take it from a merely defense point of view, and I'm not an expert, but this particular point got me interested. One of the arguments that were used after the September 11th attack of trying to explain why the Saudi defense systems weren't able to stop or detect the attack on the Aramco oil facilities in the eastern province is that these are the new kinds of security threats. The UAVs and the missiles are new kinds of wars, of irregular warfare. But this is exactly the warfare that Israel has been having for years. So to me, this justifies more security coordination with Israel. But I don't see them as becoming normal. I don't see, using the word alliance in DC to describe the relationship between Saudi Arabia, Gulf countries, and Israel. It's still very difficult for those countries to talk about alliance without solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The argument that in a country like Saudi Arabia, the current leadership has shown that it was able to go very far and implement radical changes, and that the discourse on relations with Israel has changed. Yes, the discourse on Israel has changed, but it is a parallel discourse to the continuation of the traditional discourse, and it is not taking over. And I'll be glad in the Q&A to give concrete examples of this. It is not. It is not taking over, and I don't see them becoming normal or public relations. Plus, all the changes taking place inside Saudi Arabia right now were organically grown. Relations with Israel are not organically grown inside Arab societies, especially if it is without a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then even the rapprochement with Bahrain, again, even if Bahrain's public embrace of relations with Israel, yes, it's a development, but it shouldn't be an indicator on the position of bigger countries that would pay higher cost than Bahrain for this kind of relations. But will it continue? Yes, I do expect it to continue, and I do expect it to continue being even an element in the escalation viewed from Iran, and this is something I think Ariane could be talking.
Yeah, and Nimrod, I should reveal, you and I have talked for years about the last couple of years how narrow the Kushner MBS Bibi conversation actually is, and how that is likely poised to fail inherently, because it touches upon just a narrow spectrum in the Israeli perspective, and certainly in the U.S. perspective, that if there's going to be a real dialogue, it's got to include a sense of progress and justice on the Palestinian front, but then it also has to have a wider conversation in both of our countries with those countries. How do you see sort of things unfolding on Arab-Israel?
First, the linkage to the Palestinian issue is very clear, and those attempts to dismiss it are not realistic. Yes, we see the progress in relations, but when Netanyahu tried over the last few months to get meetings in Arab capitals before the first or the second Israeli elections, he was rejected by all, at least for public meetings. From Morocco to Qatar, all the way in the middle. He didn't get it. Israel's foreign minister, currently Israel Katz, said on record recently that his goal as foreign minister is to reach peace agreements with the Gulf states. Okay, so that's a declared policy goal of the current Israeli foreign minister. And that will not happen. Even if the Palestinian issue is not on top of the priority list of the Arab countries at the moment, it's still a very clear limiting factor. And it does not enable those Arab countries that even wish to have better relations with Israel to go beyond a certain level, and they are getting quite a bit of what they want without the visibility. So the visibility in relations was important perhaps for the Saudis at a certain point of time to project that vis-a-vis Iran. but actually the economic cooperation is going in certain channels, the security cooperation is going in certain channels, so why bother and challenge yourself with moving further? The Bahrain workshop and the Trump initiative are not significant in efforts to promote Israeli-Palestinian peace. You know, the fact that a plan or a vision is being anticipated for so long without publication, while on the ground there are steps that are undermining the Palestinian leadership and position, basically paralyze the international community. So one of the changes that should happen, and again, the Israeli government will not be the next one a pro-peace leftist government, but it will have a prime minister that may want to project a different message on the two-state solution to reverse some of the negative trends that Netanyahu has been leading, some of the statements about annexation. You will see Benny Gantz on stage on Saturday at the rally in Tel Aviv in memory of the Yitzhak Rabin assassination, and he will be kind of portraying some positive messages on peace there, bringing the word peace back into the debate. So I think that discourse in a way may open up a space for different type of conversation like the one that we've been talking about between Israelis and people in Arab countries. Because having the conversation mostly by conservative Israelis and mostly on security may be effective if you have this Trump umbrella. But when the Trump umbrella is gone and the Netanyahu umbrella is gone, you need to redefine the relationship in a different way.
Now, this will be my last question, and then I'll welcome comments or questions from you. Ariane, not only my question of how the current leadership, but my curveball is this, is if we have a longer-term view and where the Iranian public actually might be in the next 10 years, is there a real possibility, if you take my assumption, that the current leadership in Iran, and you can quarrel with it, doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the broader Iranian public? Is there a possibility for a transformation in the next 10 years or so? So the first question is, how does the current leadership use the Arab-Israeli conflict for its own purposes? And then second, is it too fantastical to even discuss a whole different paradigm? It is, yeah.
So to tackle the first question, which I think is potentially shorter, I think this whole episode has certainly fed into the Iranian threat perception. Iran does thrive best when there are divisions within the region because it does fundamentally see itself as sort of othered and in a minority. And so long as there are divisions in the region, it has less of a threat perception than it would otherwise. At the same time, though, I think that, what Yasmine was saying in terms of this is not about normalization, I think that is seen very well in Iran. There is an understanding that that's not the case, that, things are not going to all of a sudden change and everybody is not going to be walking into the sunset holding hands. So I don't think that they're seeing it as a fundamental threat, but should it develop further, then it might become exactly that. Fundamentally, though, Iran sees itself sort of at war in a way currently. It may sound a little dramatic to put it this way, but the way they're seeing current U.S. policy and the way regional partners are playing into it is sort of, and they call it this, they call it war by economic means or by psychological means, which is, of course, a play on Clausewitz. And so the idea is that if these different parties that have for a long time not really had overlapping and shared objectives manage to get to a point where they are able to kind of put differences on the Arab-Israeli issue, on the Palestine issue aside, that Iran would be in a fundamentally worse place than it is currently. To tackle your second question, I don't know what the broader Iranian public thinks of the Arab-Israeli issue. I'm not aware of any polls that exist, and if they do, I would not trust them very much. But it is clear that for most Iranians, I think, it is not a question that concerns them on a day-to-day basis, right? Most people are currently, at least, very much concerned about unemployment, about inflation, about the fact that they can't afford medicine, and so on and so forth. They're not really concerned about what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. And I think there is a bit of a there's been some backlash against the regime's single-handed, single narrow focus on this topic in terms of propaganda for the past 40 years. I do think that within the elites, which I think is perhaps the more interesting question, if we assume that the regime is not going to collapse in the next 10 years, which, and it can, but I don't see it happening in the next few months. So let's take for granted that the regime is still there. I do think there is a bit of a shift in the new generation. So I guess it would be Gen X, right? The people who were not out in the streets in 1978 asking, objecting to the Shah's policies in the region and sort of rapprochement with Israel and so on and so forth. I think there is a view that they're on the moderate, on the reformist side, that they've been kind of boxed in by this issue. It's not something they really want to be talking about that much, but they have to pay lip service to it in international fora. So I think in a generation, perhaps we'll end up in a place where the Israel problem for Iran will become kind of like a frosé. No one really knows where it came from, why it came into being, but it's a thing. So that may actually happen, but I think fundamentally we can't get to a place under this current leadership, certainly until there is a succession and potentially even beyond that in the supreme leader's position, where you are able to have a sort of honest, open dialogue about Israel and potentially try to de-escalate tensions with Israel.
Great. You all have been very patient. I want to bring you in to the conversation. If you have a question, my colleague Billy or a comment has a microphone. Just raise your hand. We'll call on you. Please tell us who you are, if you have an affiliation, and if you want to direct your question to a particular panelist or to all of them. Sir.
Ken Marquardt, I'm retired. In response to your call for novel ideas, how about this? U.S. out of the Middle East.
So we've heard that actually in political debates and at the recent presidential debate. I'd actually ask our panel, starting with Nimrod, because when you hear this sort of slogan as somebody from the Israeli left, I can call you that, right? That's not an epithet. What do you think about it? And then all of you, just react in terms of who you are as analysts. What does it actually mean in practice? I mean, I'm sure you'd have definitional questions, but let's start with Nimrod and then maybe go down the line.
It's difficult to go out of the Middle East first. We saw countries in the past trying to go away, but eventually there are so many interests, so many issues. It's a region with such importance on the global scale that no matter what conflict you look at or what tension you try to de-escalate and what economic or security interests you may have or may not have, eventually the Americans have been drawn into the Middle East time and time again. I think it will happen again, and I think it should be happen proactively. So you should define what you want to get out of the Middle East and shape your involvement there in a way that serves those interests. As an Israeli, of course we want to see the Americans in the Middle East. The US is our largest, our biggest and most important ally. We want a different sort of American engagement in the Middle East than the one we saw over the last 3 years. Nevertheless, the US cannot deliver it alone. I think what we saw in the last couple of years of the Obama administration was an attempt by the Middle East to coordinate efforts, especially on Israel-Palestine, together with other international actors. And I think this is very important. So this American notion of cooperating, engaging, multi-level or multinational settings, I think that's the type of involvement that we would like to see, again, with different policy goals than the one we saw in the last years.
It's not for lack of trying, right? I think various administrations have pledged to pivot to Asia and leave the region, and it's just, it's not happened for all the reasons that Nimrod was just outlining. I personally think that we're actually going to continue being as involved in the region. We may shift the way in which we are engaged in the region, but I think we will continue to be engaged because, the main priority for the current administration, and I suspect for future administration, will be great power competition. And both Russia and China have been very active in the region, have been very active with all the countries that we're covering here. And so if we're competing, I think one major area in which we will be competing with both of those countries will be the Middle East. So to me, the question that we should be asking if we're trying to come up with plans is not whether we should be there, it's how we should be there, and to come up with the best way of doing that.
There's one more before you.
And just to follow up on what you said, I think you can look in Lebanon and the Eastern Mediterranean as two places in which American involvement is continuing. The U.S. is trying to mediate between Israel and Lebanon on maritime border issues and is trying to be more and more involved in Eastern Mediterranean cooperation, partly because those countries that you mentioned are trying to get their foot there. And the Americans do not want China or Russia to be the dominant powers in that region.
I really don't know where to start, but just to build on what Ariane has said, I mean, I agree with everything she said. To start with, the national defense strategy that focuses on great power competition and the Middle East being one of the major scenes where this is taking place. The question that always comes to my mind when I hear this is, does a U.S. withdrawal, retreat, reposturing, whatever you want to call it in the Middle East, include positions in international organizations? So does this mean that the U.S. will stop vetoing Security Council resolutions when it comes to Israel? Does this mean it will stop, orienting or influencing Saudi Arabia's allocation of funds in the World Bank and other international financial organizations? Does this mean it will stop putting pressure on its partners in terms of the arms sales? And I will not talk about arms purchases from Russia and China, even from its European allies. Will it stop? Will it give up this edge it has in the Middle East? Will it in the energy market, as he said, will it stop trying to influence the prices of oil on the international market? Will it just watch Russia and China being more influential in this in the oil market than it, and just withdraw from the Middle East because it doesn't want to get involved? Would it stop, involving in the Eastern Mediterranean and Russia's growing influence in the natural gas market? I mean, I have a whole list. If the U.S. withdrawal just means, pulling back troops and repostering troops, and if this is a priority of Gulf countries, then why would Gulf countries continue giving the U.S. what they are giving it now? Why would a country like Saudi Arabia put the U.S. as a priority in terms of the use of its financial tools, of its oil tool, and of its international religious and financial influence? So I am willing to discuss this, but, does this mean it?
If I could offer my own thoughts on the question, because actually I think, sir, I'm glad you asked it. It's a question that a lot of people are asking, including analysts. And before we go to the next question, I'd just say three things. One, if you haven't looked at it, to promote our own work, my colleagues John Halpin and I and Peter Jewell and a team, we've been listening to where the American public is at on a range of foreign policy questions, and we just released the latest data on it. We wanted to do this because it's important, I think, in a democracy, and last time I checked, I don't know what happened the last couple of hours, but we still are a democracy here in America. You need to have some modicum of support for our engagement in the Middle East and then beyond. And what we simply have not had, I would say, for a decade and a half, is a clear, strong support for what America is doing, because a lot of what has been done, the Iraq War and other things, the American public sees no value in it. They see negative value. They see cost. And the implication of your question, I think, is a very important one. So that's the first point, is that there is, when we went out and listened to people, the Middle East didn't even come up as a hot topic. It was China, climate, immigration, a whole set of issues, but it's still out there, and it's important for a lot of people, and including on the terrorism front, which is, you can think about in your own way about that, but it's still viewed through that prism, for better and for worse, and I don't think we're even close to tackling this issue of extremism and terrorism. Second, we're in 2019, and I've thought for a while now that we're at the end of a 40-year period of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East that began in 1979. The Islamic Revolution in Iran, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It actually set the framework for the U.S. deeper and deeper engagement in the Middle East. I mean, it began certainly with Saudi Arabia and the U.S. talking about oil decades before that, but what I'm talking about now is mostly a heavily militarized approach to the Middle East, one that has only become increasingly so post-Iraq War and during the War on Terror. So the third thing I would say is that I think the way I take your question is a reflection of where many Americans are at, and quite understandably so. And that the challenge really is not only for those who are policy analysts up here on the stage, but for people in our country, but then for our friends in the region to actually articulate what does a new right-sized approach to the Middle East, a balanced approach that is so focused on where our military bases are, but what it is that we can do to build partnerships with our friends in the region. And some of them are quite flawed. As we see Saudi Arabia and other places, they make mistakes. So it's not an all or nothing question. It's one of how do you calibrate it. and talk about all of these countries, not in sort of a neo-Orientalist way of, oh, the Saudis think this or the Israelis think that, but you embrace the complexity of Iran and understand these problems and understand that if the U.S. is actually going to get to a more effective policy than I think we've had over the last 10 or 15 years, it's going to be a partnership with many of these countries, and that's like a hard thing to do, but it doesn't mean a militarized approach. Let's move to the next question. Right here.
Thank you. Carl Polzer, Center on Capital and Social Equity. I know the U.S. has a checkered history on race, but one issue that really bothers me and raises concern personally for the continued, as a U.S. citizen, to support the sponsorship and funding of Israel, especially the military, is the recent legislation that sort of declared that a racial separation in terms of rights, that one set of people in one race would have more rights than another. Now that the politics are shifting more to the middle, what's going to happen with that law?
You, Nimrod.
So that was a very difficult piece of legislation for us domestically, first of all. Those believing in Israel as a democracy, as a liberal state, as a state with equality. Many of us have been fighting for years to improve equality between Jews and Arabs within Israel, while at the same time also pursuing cross-border peace agreements. So that reflected the process that is happening within our society under the last government, which was erosion of basic democratic values. Okay, so that relates less to the foreign policy dimension and more domestically, and we say it happening in other legislation dealing with civil society, in conduct related to the media. The positive aspect of all of that is that it was very personalized policies by Netanyahu. So yes, he had his allies within the government helping to push those through, but it was something that he pushed forward or let it move forward. And I think that once he's not prime minister anymore, things begin to change. So this specific legislation that you mentioned, the nation-state bill, will not be deleted altogether, but definitely blue and white, one of their policy priorities will be to fix it. How much they fix it, I don't know, because some of the party members, those from the right, were the ones to draft the initial versions of it. So you cannot expect a total fix, but some fix will be there, but the bigger fix will be on the broader issue of democracy. You know that leaders who visited Israel recently included Orban, included Salvini, Bolsonaro, Duerte. This was Netanyahu. I think a different Israeli leader will not continue that path, and you will see it in domestic issues as well as on foreign policy issues.
I mean, I think that's key to underscore is Nimrod's point about there's change maybe coming post Netanyahu, but maybe not that much internally. And what's interesting for me as an American is you see these echoes in our own debates of this struggle of the us versus them identity politics in this country, reflected in some ways, I think, inside of Israel. And that's the struggle where I think progressive voices and those that are more interested in inclusion and pluralism, we need to come together more.
The positive aspect that we do see these days is the delegitimizing again of the Arab citizens of Israel. When Netanyahu had a very negative campaign against them, and after the election, you see first their voter turnout was high, they have high representation, and they are being invited into the negotiation process for coalition forming, and they are taking a more active part in it, so that's a positive aspect on Jewish-Arab relations in Israel.
We have time for a couple more, sir. Oh, yeah, we'll go back there.
Thank you. My name is Dasko Sherwani. I'm on my court. My question is for him. Isn't it time for Israel to stop selling weapons to Turkey?
I'm not sure whether Israel is still selling weapons to Turkey. The Israeli-Turkey Security Cooperation was very big, actually for decades, starting in the late 50s, especially in the 90s. The 90s was a time in which even Netanyahu as prime minister declared the PKK as a terror organization from an Israeli point of view. I think what happened recently with the Turkish activity in northeast Syria was a very clear moral voice coming from Jerusalem against the Turkish actions and towards Kurdish rights. It wasn't translated into policy because Israel, I think, is limited in what it can do over there, but the relations with Turkey are currently in a crisis. They are not going well, Both sides are not very helpful for it. But I still think that Israel can benefit from the relation with Turkey because of what we spoke about before, about Iran. If I was in Turkey a month ago, and we heard time and time again that Turkey and Iran are not allies as people perceive in Israel, but rather Turkey and Israel have the same interest of limiting Iranian influence in Syria. And that's a place of dialogue. So while Israel and Turkey do not have this military cooperation that they did before, and people in Israel do not want it, they do not trust the Turkish military for that, there is still room for strategic dialogue that can help both countries promote stability in the region.
Back there.
Thank you very much. Kıvanç Ulusoy from Istanbul University. Until the Q&A session, I was surprised that the words Russia, Turkey, Syria never mentioned by any of the panelists. So now we see, because both escalation of the tensions and the de-escalation of the tensions are more related with the external powers now, more and more involving with the region, as I see. I have two quick questions. One to my friend Nimrod. You mentioned the international engagement, the necessity of international engagement of Israel, and you mentioned the need of engaging with democracies, etc. You have two democracies in the region except for Israel. One is Cyprus Republic, the other is Turkey. Is there any, let's say, Israeli initiative to bring these two democracies together in the case of the Eastern Mediterranean? And another question to a colleague from, speaking on Iran, seeing the danger of the closure of the Hormuz Strait, can Iran increase its influence on the Eastern Mediterranean, because it will need another outlet for its oil, and the Eastern Mediterranean, I think, is key for Iran. So you might link your answer to the situation in Syria too. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly trying, right? Iran, so a couple of things. One is that despite everything that has happened, I think there is a realization in Iran that it should not close the Strait of Hormuz. That's why, despite everything that we've seen, they have tried to stay away from altogether closing the strait, which has been a fear in Washington for a while. The answer is mostly because China. Iran has an incentive to keep the Chinese on their good side, and they've tried to navigate everything while having China sort of on the positive side. But Iran has certainly tried to increase its maritime presence elsewhere. It now has a presence in the Bab el-Mandeb, for example, very different sort of presence from what it has in the Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz, mostly sort of the conventional military, mostly doing anti-piracy type work. But it is certainly trying to build that presence. And Syria, of course, fits into that. I do think that part of the rationale for keeping Iraq, keeping Syria, and keeping sort of that sort of pathway to Lebanon has to do with the fact that Iran would like to have the opportunity to have a presence in the region. Although I don't think it is the sort of top goal, but I think it's part of it.
So in Israel, there will be question marks about the definition of democracy in Turkey and what is going on in recent years. And that will lead people who are traditionally more pro-Israel-Turkey relations, that were usually on the more center-left side of Israeli politics, to a bit move away from the topic, because they look at what happened in Turkey domestically and what they perceive that to mean. It doesn't mean that pro-democracy actors in Israel and Turkey should not work together, much like they should seek pro-democracy partners in other countries, in the region and beyond. So this idea of a pro-democracy alliance facing the global challenges of democracy is something that at our institute we see much value in. And we try to reach out to those actors, while also acknowledging the need to work with those that are not sharing the same ideological views, but are in positions of power. The democratic component is very strong in Israel's relations with Greece and Cyprus, not Turkey and Cyprus. Israel has what is called the Hellenic Alliance That's an alliance, a much more significant alliance than with the regional countries. It's been developing over the last few years, beginning with natural gas economy, but moving to many other issues. The fear in Turkey is that that alliance is an anti-Turkish alliance. Israel, I think, is time and time again trying to make the case that from an Israeli perspective, that's not an issue. Maybe in Cyprus, maybe in Greece, it's been viewed that way. But I think that Israel will benefit for having more inclusive mechanism, institution, entities in the Eastern Mediterranean, which include both Turkey and Egypt, both Turkey and Cyprus. And if Israel can play any role in bridging the gaps between Turkey, Cyprus, or Turkey and Egypt, I think we will be the first one to benefit from that.
Great. I think we have one more question down here.
My name is Jacob Koenig. I'm not really affiliated with any institute, but I'm a former student of Nimrod. And I have a question for Nimrod, but also for the panel, and it has to do with the Israeli-Arab issue. And what I'm curious about is how a future Israeli government is going to handle the American administration's recognition of Jerusalem as the Israeli capital, and also the Golan as being part of Israel. You know, does a future Israeli government try to defend that position going forward as a new, I guess, as a new benchmark in future negotiations with the Arabs or the Iranians? And how does anyone react to that in future negotiations?
Start and then Yasmine. Do you have anything on this?
So in terms of Golan, there is no significant change in Israeli policy because the Israeli annexation of the Golan happened in the early 80s. So the American position, once it happens, didn't indicate any change in the Israeli position, and I'm not sure how much Israel really needed that. In a way, it was part of those election gifts that Netanyahu was getting for Trump in an attempt to show how much leverage Netanyahu has over the American administration. Once the elections are over, the importance of that step, I think, is over as well. The Jerusalem issue is different because Jerusalem is a consensus issue in the Israeli political system. Very few can say that they oppose such an American move. They will criticize the timing, they will criticize the style, but it's very difficult to hear within the mainstream Israeli political field people criticizing the actual move with an American recognition of Jerusalem as a capital. Those that are trying to move forward peace, like we do, will try to put that in a context which is constructive and that rebuilds trust with the Palestinians, namely a next American administration that has a clear statement on the two-state solution, with East Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital, and with an American embassy that will be open there. And also reopening both the PLO representation here in Washington, and also splitting what is, I don't know if you know, but the Americans kind of subordinated the consulate that dealt with Palestinian issue to the embassy that did with Israeli issues. Splitting that again will show that there is a reversal of policies in an attempt to reach out once again to those Palestinians that Trump kind of put aside.
So actually in both the cases of, whether Jerusalem move or the move on the Golan Heights were actually moments where we saw some kind of change or shift in the policies of some of Arab countries, whether Saudi Arabia or Arab countries, when it comes to their alignment on the U.S. and the reluctance to stand up to the Trump administration because they have interests with them. So if you take, for example, the Golan Heights, it was absolutely condemned and rejected by most of Arab countries. A country like Saudi Arabia announced that it's absolutely rejected it. But also it triggered the conversation about let's welcome Syria back into the Arab fold, and it would be, at the beginning of attracting it back from Iran. So it triggered a policy of, it gave them a window to resume or actually to progress on their path of talks and rapprochement with the Assad regime and accepting the fait accompli and thinking about engagement with the Assad regime as being a better strategy to get Syria back into the Arab versus Iranian camp. On the Jerusalem issue, it was also the trigger of a change, at least even in the public statements inside Saudi Arabia. This is when, after a year or more than a year of leaks of Saudi position changing on Jerusalem and of causing tensions with Jordan because there is this Saudi ambition of having the custodianship over Al-Aqsa Mosque and of a changing position of Saudi Arabia on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a whole. When the Trump administration took the decision decision on Jerusalem, you had the Saudi king stepping up the narrative and stepping up the emphasis on the traditional position of Saudi Arabia in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that started by naming the Arab Summit the Jerusalem Summit. And then there was a series of measures taken afterwards to reinstate the traditional Saudi position that supports a two-state solution with Eastern Jerusalem as the capital within the borders of 1967. And this is why when we started seeing, doubts about the capacity of Saudi Arabia to go very far in terms of supporting the, peace, the deal of the century, whatever the content of it is.
If I could just say, and to close out, I saw those moves by the Trump administration, both on the Jerusalem embassy move and the Golan Heights, disconnected from any serious strategy to resolve the conflict in the region. It was completely, on the Jerusalem case, he was doing something that frankly was supported by both Democrats and Republicans in Congress for years, but was disconnected from any strategy. He was giving something up on the final status issues without getting anything in return, and in fact got a negative return, meaning that the concerns of Jordan, of Egypt, those countries that already have peace deals, and including if you look at the Egyptian-Israel peace treaty and the annex, these moves violate the spirit of it. If you look at countries like Oman or Morocco that don't have this rejectionist stance to Israel and send officials to Israel all the time, this move was deeply discomforting for them because it in essence sells out not only what they see as a Palestinian right, but then also something, a connection that Muslims have. So how do you, the next administration, my assumption is that Donald Trump does not issue his plan or the political side of it. I may be wrong, but I don't see a propitious environment for doing that. How do you pick up the pieces from all of this? And I think some of the ideas that some people are discussing, including what was mentioned up here, is recognizing a two-state solution if one is still possible, and having an embassy for the U.S. in East Jerusalem, and talking about these moves, I think are essential to be done in coordination with the region. And that's what I think was another flaw of the Trump approach, which was to, in essence, try to pick off certain aspects of the Saudi leadership and push through a plan that would not be rejected by would not be accepted by the Palestinians, and not have a comprehensive just settlement of it. So I think we're in for a very bumpy period. I would say, in my last sort of comment on all of this, is that in addition to maximum pressure on Iran, we've in essence had maximum pressure on Palestinians coming from the Trump administration, cutting aid, some of the programs I worked on 20 years ago, things that are trying to pressurize the Palestinian leadership and the people, and it actually has not made the conditions for peace stronger. So if we don't have a President Trump in 2021, and if there isn't a major conflict with Gaza or in the West Bank, we're going to have a lot of diplomatic work, not military, diplomatic work to actually do to pick up the pieces and work with the region. And those voices, I think, in Jordan and Egypt, in the Gulf, that are open to a conversation, but only one that talks about a just, equitable settlement to this conflict, not some sort of half solution that is about economic peace. So we're out of time. Thank you for listening, and please join me in thanking the panelists for this.